Hello there. I didn't see you walk in. Good morning. This is Watches Today. In the wake of Watches and Wonders, I asked the question, what will it cost to service all of those new watches down the line? Today, we answer that question generally, and we check out your viewer wrist shots today on Watches Today. In the meantime, Tim_Masso, check me out on Instagram. It's the life of Tim. Cars, watches, occasionally squash. All of it in 60-second snippets so you can follow it fast and furious. Check out the official after party to Watches Today, Tim Masso on Instagram. All right, viewer wrist shots number one. It's a bumper crop and it's only the good stuff. Starting with Kuyen T, who drives his Ferrari FF with Rolex Daytona on summer white rubber. Looking good. I love the FF. That's probably my favorite Ferrari. Joey shares his newly arrived Patek Philippe 5396G017. Wear it in good health, Joey. That is the Diamond Index White Gold Gradient Dial Annual Calendar. It is the bee's knees. We got Richard C. from South Florida, an old friend who wears his new Rolex Land Dweller, driving the Mercedes-Benz S500 4MATIC, that's four-wheel drive, AMG, looking good in both cases. You got your analog and your digital all on my screen. We got Yanis, joins us from Switzerland with his Aftermarket Royal Oak 56175 on the canal. Ruben S., who takes an upscale wrist shot with embroidered cuffs, and Patek Philippe 5905 flyback chronograph annual calendar. Jeff S. is full of surprises with his Arm & Strom Pure Resonance for Oster Jewelers, and that one is Horror Mario Bro inspired. Very cool, Jeff. We got Dr. Taylor, who wears his Audemars Royal Oak Offshore Summer Biblos edition with a Richard Petty tuned Jeep Wrangler Rubicon Hemi 6.4, but this one is now a 448 with 650 horsepower. And send your horsepower, large and small, to Monday Mailbag at the1916company.com to see those wrists on my lists. All right. It seems that just asking questions about watches can be scary, and none more so than what is the price of watch service, or what does it cost to service my watch? Aside from walking into a gym, especially that gym, or maybe a bike shop, especially if you can't grip it and rip it. Few things are as intimidating as asking this basic question about watch collecting. What does it cost to service a watch? Let's start with this gut-wrenching and wallet-flattening question, because what does service cost should have an easy, accessible answer, given that it's so common. In fact, when you buy the product, it's an inevitability. Despite being one of the most common features of owning a luxury watch, service scope, price, and duration of time are often thought to be completely opaque, and at least in half the cases, that's true. So, to be fair, there are some horror stories floating around. Moreover, unlike these frankly terrifying stories of pale crawlers down in the Carolina, check that out, cryptids, scary stuff. Many of these watch horror stories, though, are actually true. Sorry, pale crawler, but you've been upstaged. I've seen an Audemars Piguet Royal Oak chronograph standard steel watch Piguet movement generate a $15,000 repair invoice for water damage, and the water damage had only had about a day to set in. I've seen an FP Journe Grande Sonnerie that was actually a $50,000 invoice, and I've had this exact watch, actually this very Halter Barnes Antiqua that you're seeing on your screen, was quoted an ever-escalating price from $50,000 to $60,000 to $70,000 to $80,000 back in about 2015 as our Watch You Want clients cross-checked the watch we had for sale with what the factory was quoting to service it before actually buying our watch, and that price seemed to go up every single time somebody pinged the Halter factory. So yeah, that's to say that some of these horror stories are genuinely true, and the prices quoted in some cases are almost pornographic. In that case, I will say, though, at least the reason was clear. It wasn't that it costs $80,000 to service this, it was that the factory would have preferred the client instead buy a new one for almost the same price as the service. So that's what was going on there. It doesn't take 80 grand to service that watch. But I've also seen some nightmares where service centers blew past and straight up ignored requests to, for example, preserve the dial features that distinguish one of these Omega Speedmaster Professional Ultramans. And in that case, they actually did remove all the parts despite being explicitly asked not to do so, and another case where a famous Geneva watch brand's factory-engraved National Police combat swimmer caseback with insignia was actually band-sanded off a caseback. So I've seen some very bad things happen in the service environment, all of which is to say, if you're a little bit unnerved, there is some precedent to justify that. But I don't think you should be terrified, and I don't think this should be a mystery. The horror stories are real, but they're not the rule. We're going to talk about the rule now. Keep in mind, the most of what I just described involves some kind of repair, not necessarily routine service, and repair and service are not the same thing. Okay, viewerist chats number 2. I asked, you answered. Let's start with Charlie B, who joins from London. Is that an iconic British shot or what? You've got the location, you've got the tower, you've got the bus, you've got the wheel, and it's all there and so very British with his Laureato 38 with copper dial. I love that. Awate, well done, my man. But this one is a Bell 1911 El Primero chronograph, full steel, full bracelet, black dial, with a contemporary Lexus, or at least we'll call this a neo-vintage Lexus since it's a few years young. Eddie P joins from beneath the cherry blossoms with his Audemars Piguet Royal chronograph during Sakura in Korea. We got the cherry blossoms here in Philadelphia right now, and it's gorgeous. We have Jim M, who collected a new to him 1969 Omega Speedmaster Mark II racing dial at a vintage shop in Fort Myers, and not necessarily a vintage watch shop. This was General Antiques. So Jim, well found, well bought. Ali P was ahead of last week's new watch episode with his original Rado Diastar green dials. When I was talking about buying my next watch, I talked about this one. Ali was already there. Dr. P, well done, my man. Send your wrist shots to Monday Mailbag at the1916company.com to see your pieces on these pixels. What does watch service cost? For one thing, let's dispel a myth. Let's bust a myth in the parlance of our times. Watch pricing on the service side is not as opaque as we think it is. Maybe 5 to 10 years ago it was, but a few cursory searches reveal that not only perennial standout Mito, which has long listed very reasonable service prices on its website, but also the much larger and more upscale Omega, Patek Philippe, and even Audemars Piguet, which can be a bit of a black box, list ballpark figures that are pretty accurate for watches that only need a cleaning, oiling, and adjustment. That is, they don't have any damage or need for parts replacement. So this is surprisingly transparent, and when I went online to research this episode, I expected to find a few. I didn't expect that in every instance that I searched a brand, I would actually find a guide to pricing for service interventions with individual models and types of movements and hard numbers. In fact, it wasn't hard to find at all. Even Lange, which is often a bit of the iron curtain of watch retail, offers service price estimates and even restoration price estimates for historic pieces. Moreover, they seem kind of reasonable. For that matter, Omega, and I'll give them credit for this because they are a mass manufacturer, they also list specialist restoration and service costs for exceptional pieces. And that's pretty transparent and frankly, based on what I've seen industry-wide, also pretty reasonable. Well-priced Omega, and thank you for including the difference between regular service and a restoration or a special piece. Brands are getting better at pricing transparency when it comes to service, and I give them a lot of credit for this because there is a lot that's unknown when you take a client's watch in-house. To be able to put out an estimate before you see the watch is kind of bold, but it also shows that you're doing enough service business that you have ballpark figures that are reliable. Recognition that historic fabric must be retained whenever possible is also evident in the emergence of these separate tracks for restoration, like the Omega and Lange programs above. That is not a watch you restore, but maybe 40 years down the line, it will be. And also, Rolex has a low-key atelier program. It's not heavily advertised, maybe because they don't want to be overwhelmed with volume, but that's also a restoration product for historic models that's different from Rolex factory service. So even Rolex is creating a twin track setup for regular watches and then vintage watch restoration. And that's moving in a positive direction. It means there are going to be fewer mistakes where historic pieces go in and some disaster happens, a dial or hands or some insignia get wiped off the watch. With restoration projects, companies are a lot more sensitive to those special needs and more likely to retain the fabric correctly. My own experience with factory restoration was even a positive one when I sent in my 1974 JLC Memovox Snowdrop, the E877, and went to Le Sentier for a factory restoration with express instructions to save the dial and hands if possible and absolutely avoid polishing the case. And in all three instances, the dial, the hands, and the case, they followed instructions perfectly. I got the watch back at a very reasonable price. The whole thing came in under $2,000, and it was specifically a vintage restoration, not a routine cleaning, oiling, and adjustment. So that's a big win for JLC and the Swiss watch industry in general. Here's what you need to do to protect yourself with watch service costs. First, buy, if you can, when you're buying, buy a watch. If it's not new, get a documented service history. The more recent, the better. Good owners will keep these invoices, understanding that they are important to subsequent owners. They're part of the history of the watch, and they can substantially raise the marketability of a very complicated watch like this JLC Triptyque when it hits the market. It is a warm, fuzzy feeling to know this has been through the factory because it's got 18 functions and 3 dials. In that sense, it's just like buying a specialized used car. You want to make sure that your Ferrari, your Lamborghini, your Porsche has that little book stamped with all of the regular factory services documented in the back. It raises the value of the car and it protects the money you spend and put into that piece, whether it's a car or a watch. Second, when buying a luxury watch, assume that a comprehensive cleaning, oiling, and adjustment, or a COA, that's what we mean when we say a service, a COA. Keep in mind, that should cost about 10% of the price of the watch. Some will be more, some will be less. But in general, unless we're talking about some crazy thing like Paul Newman's Daytona bought at an auction, a new watch, or one that's priced pre-owned, is generally, in both cases, going to cost something like 10% of what you pay to service it. And I find that's pretty consistent whether the watch is new or pre-owned. So when you're budgeting, make sure that if you're buying a $50,000 watch, you've got $5,000 to service it. If you're buying a $100,000 watch, again, if it's not some sort of vintage thing where the price is being paid for a rarity as opposed to mechanical refinement, but if you're buying a $100,000 watch, again, save $10,000 for the service. Sometimes it's best to go by retail price because aftermarket can be a little bit variable. Sometimes you see a watch that's sold for $200,000 selling for $100,000. In that case, you should definitely just assume that the $200,000 multi-complication is going to cost it's going to cost you $20,000 to service. So if you do have the original retail price, 10% of that, make that your base case for servicing that watch. Third, almost all major watch brands, including the infamous Richard Mille, and I've heard a lot of bad stories about RM service, but even Richard Mille now publishes a table of service costs, and so do many of the other large-scale independents. Remember, RM makes about 5,000 to 6,000 watches a year. This won't take the sting out of 5-figure full service and refinishing pricing, and you can see it right down there on the lower right hand. But it will take the surprise out of that pricing. RM even has a pretty sophisticated lookup table by model, including very rare models, with all of this long form description of what you get and the price you'll pay in Swiss francs. So I consider that a big win for RM because it's very model specific and it gives you the most specific answer rather than the biggest ballpark. This probably gives you an idea of the number that's going on your American Express Black Card when you service your RM. This is a huge industry-wide change from, again, even 5 or 6 years ago when this whole thing was often a guessing game. People would go on forums and ask other dudes, what kind of service invoices did you receive? And then hope maybe they could get like a phone photo of the service receipt. It was very difficult to determine. Now it's a lot more open, and since these tables are updated, if the price increases, it should be on the website. Now here's the bad news. time frames, the communication process during the life cycle of the service, and surprise charges from parts replacement or repair are still a reality when we're talking about the price of servicing a watch. And now we're talking about the price beyond money, because time is money and your time is valuable. So part of this is the battle between humans and machines. And while that might be a classic matchup, it's not quite what I had in mind. Once upon a time, building a watch and servicing a watch were almost the same task. Because when servicing a watch, you take it apart, clean it, oil it, adjust it, put it back together. Well, that was a lot like building it the first time. But manufacturing technology has raced ahead of service procedure. So you still take it apart and put it back together when you're servicing it. You do that by hand, but now many of the factories are so roboticized that assembly is completely automated. What this means is that, well, the machines are going to win that battle. They will be able to outstrip the productivity of human beings on the service side. And the industry is set up to build watches, not necessarily to service them. Here's an example. Remember American folk legend, the nail driver John Henry? Probably in the 19th century, he raced the steam hammer, and he beat the steam hammer, but he then died of his exertion. Well, here's the thing. In the story, the steam driver, or the steam hammer, is like the modern automated watch factory building the watches. And John Henry is like their service department, incredibly skilled but still human and working at the speed that humans can work. Consider how many watches are made by machines by the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, and millions each year. But overhaul almost always requires a person to take the watch, disassemble it, inspect every part, evaluate their condition, and then replace, repair, clean, oil, adjust, and time the watch. And that's going to be done with our little fingers. So here's the problem. As a result, and exacerbated by the explosive growth of interest in watches over the last 3 decades, manufacturing is building millions more than service from almost every brand is actually scaled to handle. As with Neo, no matter how strong, eventually there's just too many Smiths. And that's the situation we find ourselves in regarding the time it takes to service watches and also the lack of communication during the process. And it's likely to stay this way for a while because the robots are not coming to our rescue. Robotics and AI expert Rodney Brooks, who knows a lot about both, has written extensively on this topic. Large language model AI, which is basically every AI right now, and sensory dexterity exist in completely different worlds, and there's no translating the former to the latter. So you're stuck with humans in watchmaking on the service side for a long time at least. Brooks notes that there are 17,000 specialized receptors in the human hand, and the mapping and thresholds of these are completely intangible to AI models that are trained on text, pictures, and language-based user feedback in order to learn. There's no haptic database that compares to video, pictures, and online text. I suspect that this problem, more than the added value, is what's driving the last decade's massive decline in, well, basically the frequency of service. You ever notice how it seems like we went from 2-year warranties to 3-year, 4-year, 5-year, 8-year, and even 10-year warranties and service intervals to match? And I think more than trying to add value for the customer, what you're really seeing is brands doing everything they can with production tolerances and modern lubricants and manufacturing techniques to try to forestall service as long as possible. So behind these ever-extending warranties and service intervals, I see the hand of, well, human hands and their limitations, with manufacturers doing everything they can, almost like the federal government raising the retirement rate to forestall the bankruptcy of Social Security. The watch brands are trying to push that first service as far back as they can, and we've seen a lot of those expanding warranties and service intervals over the last 10 years. There might be more to it than meets the eye. Okay, viewer response number 3. I asked, you answered. We've got some good ones. Will L. hikes the mountains of Colorado, not in the air, But the Air King is welcome on the ground. That's his vintage Air King 14,000 reference. Saurabh P. overlooks LA from a classic hilltop vantage point with his Space One world time. That's like a shot straight out of the 60s. Jake S. of Charleston, South Carolina, shares his Oris Big Crown pointer date bullseye. Lawrence and his Omega Speedmaster Professional get up close and personal with a 1,280 horsepower Koenigsegg. Lawrence L., the other Lawrence, upstages Koenigsegg with the Pininfarina Battista, built by Mate Rimac and Casio calculator watch. You actually have the Quartz watch and the Quartz supercar because it's an EV. Okay, guys, what about independent service? Do I have to send my watch to the factory and pay a factory rate? Well, let's be clear about a few things. Not all watches need to return to their manufacturers for service, but there are times when you should or even must. Let's go over some of those. You must send the watch back to the factory if it's under manufacturer warranty. You have so many reasons, if you own this Aquanaut and it's under warranty, to send it back to Patek Philippe if it needs something. When somebody has a modern Patek, Vacheron, Rolex, or Omega under factory warranty, and they ask me if they should send it to their local guy to get it done quicker, I ask, first of all, why would you not accept a free service from the people who know the watch best? And second, why would you forfeit your factory warranty coverage? Because you will if you have some dude outside of factory service channels try to work on this watch under warranty. The factory will know if you have to go back and get his work fixed, they're going to see that some dude outside of factory service centers touched your watch and now you're paying for the fix. And it most often is just because your guy downtown says he could do this in a weekend instead of 3 months like a factory warranty claim. If you're so impatient that you can't wait for warranty work by a factory workshop, I would say either don't buy modern watches or don't buy luxury watches at all, or have more than one watch so you've got something to wear while one of them's at service, or get a swatch watch like I did with my Blancpain Scuba so you've got something fun to wear while the luxury watch is in the shop. Again, it's like why you would have a Honda Civic Si when your Ferrari is in for a week of maintenance or 2 weeks of maintenance. You've still got something fun to drive that's not going to break the bank. Again, if your guy messes up, what the hell do you tell the authorized dealer when you take the aftermarket mangled watch to request factory correction? I was stupid and impatient? They're probably not going to accept that. Okay, a watch that returns from factory service. Here's another reason why you want to use factory service when it's under warranty, because usually when a watch returns from factory service, it's going to retain the balance of its original manufacturer warranty, or let's say, I don't know, you've got 1 year of warranty left, you send it in for service. Most service warranties are now 2 years. So you're going to get a renewed and maybe even extended factory warranty for having sent it in for free for service. That's a really good deal. I wouldn't refuse it. For certain exotic and collectible watches, and there's 5 of them right there, any service other than by the factory could massacre the value of a watch. If you're selling one of these, it's great to have the service receipt from Journe. Even if it was more than 5 to 10 years ago, just showing that it's been cared for at some point by the manufacturer for something like this adds a lot of patrimony, history, and credibility to the watch's longevity. So if it's been to the factory at any point, that's almost like a feather in your cap. Plus, here's the thing. Brands will know if the watch has been opened by an unauthorized party. I don't always know how they know. Sometimes it's weird seals, the orientation of a screw, little tells they leave. But they give themselves breadcrumbs and they will always know. So here's the thing. Many will add a surcharge to your service request if they realize the watch has ever been opened by an unauthorized party. I'm not talking about a watch under warranty going to an aftermarket guy who can't figure it out and then you take it to the factory, theoretically still in the warranty period. I'm talking about a watch that's been out of warranty for 10 years, but a brand like Journe, if they find out that someone else opened it up and touched it, they're probably going to increase the price on the invoice and they may even double it. And I've heard stories like that. So even if it's outside of warranty, it might be in your interest to just go to the factory the first time. And in general, that's what a good aftermarket vendor of a used specialist watch will do. If it needs any work, send it back to the factory. It doesn't help anyone to do otherwise. The simple solution there is to protect your interests and the investment and its integrity and just go with the people who know the watch best. Again, given what these are worth, why deal with the aggravation and the risk? And why pay any more than you have to? And sometimes a watch is so unusual that all those case, movement, and dial parts are going to be unique to the brand and its watches. To save a few bucks, I would not attempt to have some dude work on this watch, which is an APRP-built movement for HYT. And HYT, especially with an APRP movement and proprietary fluidic display technology, it's that kind of watch where the factory is the only resource you should trust because it might be the only game in town that can actually fix the thing properly. But RM is another good example, and it's not just expensive watches or crazy watches. Something like Christopher Ward, which is increasingly proprietary and in-house, could be considered an example of a company whose parts, think Bel Canto, are specialized enough that the aftermarket probably shouldn't be touching them. Now, there are times when you can take a watch to an aftermarket watchmaker and not face grim consequences. And in general, there are 4 reasons to do so. First, the watch is not under factory warranty. Remember what I said about some watches needing unique factory resources or being subject to retaliation for non-factory service? Well, post-warranty watches at least open the door, because you're not going to be losing a factory warranty. So what kind of post-warranty watch would you send to an aftermarket shop? Well, second, it would be a watch that does not require specialized parts, knowledge, tools, movement holders. Only a manufacturer or agent could provide. If you have something like my own Omega Seamaster, many shops can work on this. I have sent it to both the factory and credible aftermarket service places to have this serviced for me over the years. And if it goes to a good watchmaker, this watch will always be fine. No stories or tales to relate. Both aftermarket and the factory did a great job on this simple, common watch. 3, you might use an aftermarket service outlet if the watch uses a universally understood and widely practiced model of movement. That's an SW510, which is a Valjoux 7750. The 7750, 6497, 6498, 2824, 2892, a famous Geneva watch brand and many of its historic movements, any Schild, Caliber, Longines, Fleurier, and many others are understood and routinely serviced by independent watchmakers worldwide. Finally, sometimes restoration resources do not exist at the factory. Consider Universal Genève. Now, it's just been relaunched as a brand, but the original factory, its tools, its parts, its service documents, its resources, its watchmakers, they don't exist anymore. It's changed substantially since the watch was made. Consider Bugatti. This is a real Bugatti from the era of Ettore Bugatti. The current factory that made this Bugatti Tourbillon is not the factory that built that first car and could not fix the vintage car, so you wouldn't ask them. You'd go to a Pebble Beach Concours grade restoration shop and they would fix your Bugatti Type 37 or Type 51. A subset of this might take into consideration whether the factory has a good reputation, whether the watch factory that made your watch has a good reputation for understanding the difference between a routine service and restoration for historic pieces, plus whether requests to retain historic fabric are reliably obeyed. Do some research first, because that is a real thing, and I would definitely want to know what you're getting into before you send something back that has a hand, dial, case, engraving that couldn't be replaced. Independent service can offer a lot of advantages over factory work, including faster turnaround, greater transparency throughout the process, i.e. communication, a relationship with a trusted local provider, and in some cases, access to local shops that do have legacy ETA, Rolex, Omega, or other parts accounts. Those are still out there. They're not all factory. There are still some independent shops with parts accounts. Still, everything has to line up perfectly before you send your watch to an aftermarket watchmaker. So know what you're dealing with. Know the watchmaker and know the watch. Viewers Chats number 4, Bob M. of Cleveland joins us with his rarely seen King Seiko SLA 087. Chris B. tackles the dishes with the right tool for the job, his Seiko SKX 007. Josh P. of Toronto and his sub faced the unenviable task of cleaning up a big mess, and apparently 1,500 pounds was his share. Pete W. and his Brew Metric Retro literally brew a cup of tea. Darth Muppet takes us home with his Zelos Helios Aventurine in Aruba at California Lighthouse with another to put a bow tie on it all. And there it is. Well done. Guys, be well, have fun. We're coming back from Watches and Wonders. Be sure to check our coverage if you're watching this on the 19th. And until I'm back on the air, from me and Little Tim and Garrett on the switcher, time out.